In the dim candlelight of a Florentine study, centuries ago, Niccolò Machiavelli penned words that would echo through time, revealing truths about human nature that remain as cutting today as they were in the Renaissance. Among his most profound insights lies a principle that transcends political maneuvering and reaches into the very core of personal mastery, the art of becoming so focused and detached that one becomes unreadable, and, through the deliberate destruction of one's weak self, achieving a state where others cannot destroy what no longer exists to be destroyed. This document explores the profound transformation that occurs when an individual embraces these twin concepts: impenetrable focus paired with strategic self-annihilation of weakness, creating a persona that operates beyond the reach of conventional manipulation, emotional leverage, or psychological warfare. The journey from transparency to opacity, from vulnerability to invulnerability, represents not merely a tactical advantage but a fundamental restructuring of one's relationship with the world and oneself. Part 1, The Architecture of Unreadability. The human face, Machiavelli observed, is the most honest part of the body, yet it can be trained to become the most deceptive. This paradox forms the foundation of developing an impenetrable presence, not through falsehood, but through the cultivation of such profound inner focus that external observers find themselves looking upon a surface that reflects nothing of the depths beneath. Consider the master chess player in the moments before a critical move. Their expression reveals nothing of the complex calculations unfolding within their mind, the multiple scenarios being weighed, or the emotional investment in the outcome. This is not mere poker face, it is the natural result of complete absorption in the task at hand, a state where the conscious mind becomes so unified with purpose that it ceases to leak its contents through unconscious tells and reactions. The development of this unreadable state begins with understanding what makes most people so easily deciphered. The average individual carries their emotions, intentions, and thoughts close to the surface, allowing them to spill over into their expressions, body language, and speech patterns. They react immediately to stimuli, wear their hearts on their sleeves, and telegraph their moves well in advance of making them. This transparency, while often valued in personal relationships, becomes a profound liability in competitive environments where information asymmetry determines outcomes. The transformation toward unreadability requires first developing an acute awareness of one's own emotional and mental processes. Like a scientist studying their own reactions, the practitioner must learn to observe their internal states without being consumed by them. This self-observation creates a buffer zone between experience and expression, between feeling and reaction. In this space, choice emerges, the choice of what to reveal, when to reveal it, and to whom. The businessman who has mastered this principle sits across from his negotiating partner, listening to an offer that internally delights him beyond measure. Yet his face reveals nothing, not pleasure, not displeasure, merely attentive consideration. His counterpart, unable to read any reaction, begins to doubt their position, perhaps sweetening the deal unnecessarily or revealing information in an attempt to gauge his response. The power in this dynamic flows not from deception but from the disciplined management of information flow. This unreadable state extends far beyond mere facial control. It encompasses the entire presentation of self, posture, tone of voice, choice of words, and even the timing of responses. The master of this art responds to insults with the same measured consideration they give to compliments. They receive bad news with the same composure they maintain when hearing good news. This consistency creates a frustrating opacity for those seeking to manipulate or predict their behavior. Yet this is not emotional numbness or suppression. Rather, it represents the achievement of what might be called emotional sovereignty, the ability to feel deeply while maintaining complete control over the expression of those feelings. The practitioner experiences the full range of human emotion but has developed the discipline to let none of it escape without conscious permission. The cultivation of such focus requires rigorous mental training. Like a monk who can meditate undisturbed while chaos erupts around them, the individual seeking unreadability must develop the capacity for sustained, unshakable concentration. This involves training the mind to maintain singular focus despite external pressures, distractions, or provocations designed to elicit revealing reactions. One practical approach involves what might be termed simulation training, deliberately placing oneself in situations designed to test emotional control while maintaining awareness of one's reactions. The stock trader who can watch significant losses without flinching has likely spent years developing this capacity, learning to separate the emotional impact of financial loss from the strategic decision-making required to navigate volatile markets. The social dynamics of unreadability create fascinating ripple effects. When others cannot predict or manipulate someone's responses, they often project their own fears, desires, and assumptions onto that person. The unreadable individual becomes a blank screen upon which others display their own psychological content, inadvertently revealing far more about themselves than they learn about their intended target. This phenomenon creates a powerful information advantage. While maintaining their own privacy, the focused individual gains unprecedented access to the unguarded thoughts and feelings of others. People tend to fill silence with revelation, interpret neutrality as agreement or disagreement based on their own biases, and attempt to break through apparent indifference by offering increasingly personal information. The development of this skill requires patience and persistence. Initial attempts at maintaining unreadability often result in awkward artificiality, forced stillness that itself becomes readable as an attempt at concealment. True mastery emerges only when the focused state becomes natural, when the discipline has been so thoroughly integrated that it requires no conscious effort to maintain. The philosophical implications of this transformation run deep. To become unreadable is to step partially outside the normal flow of social interaction, to occupy a position of observer rather than merely participant. This shift in perspective often brings profound insights about human nature, social dynamics, and the mechanisms through which people influence and manipulate each other. Yet this power comes with responsibility. The ability to remain opaque while others reveal themselves creates ethical considerations about how such information should be used. The Machiavellian practitioner must grapple with questions of fairness, reciprocity, and the moral implications of one-sided transparency in relationships. The master of unreadability often finds themselves in the peculiar position of being simultaneously more connected to and more distant from others. Their enhanced ability to observe without judgment often leads to deeper understanding of human nature, yet their refusal to be easily known can create barriers to intimate connection. This tension between understanding and isolation becomes a constant challenge in the pursuit of perfect focus. As the practitioner develops these skills, they often discover that the most profound unreadability comes not from hiding their thoughts and feelings, but from achieving such clarity of purpose that their responses become unpredictable precisely because they are freed from the conventional emotional and social programming that makes most people's behavior forecastable. The truly focused individual operates from a center of calm certainty that makes their actions appear almost alien to those trapped in reactive patterns. They respond to situations based on strategic consideration rather than emotional impulse, choose their battles based on long-term objectives rather than immediate satisfaction, and maintain consistency of purpose despite changing external circumstances. This transformation from transparency to opacity, from reactive to responsive, represents the first crucial step in achieving the Machiavellian ideal of personal sovereignty. Yet it is only the foundation upon which the second, more radical transformation must be built, the deliberate destruction of the weak self that serves as the source of vulnerability and manipulation. Part 2, The Alchemy of Self-Destruction. The second phase of this transformation requires embracing a concept that appears paradoxical to conventional thinking: the deliberate destruction of aspects of oneself that serve as points of vulnerability. This is not self-hatred or nihilistic destruction, but rather a calculated process of identifying and eliminating the psychological weak points that others can exploit to influence, control, or defeat us. Machiavelli understood that every strength carried within it the seeds of potential weakness, and that the wise individual must constantly audit their own character for such vulnerabilities. The generous person can be manipulated through their generosity, the proud through their pride, the fearful through their fears. The process of self-destruction involves systematically identifying these psychological pressure points and either eliminating them entirely or transforming them into sources of strength. Consider the executive who discovers that his deep need for approval from authority figures has repeatedly led him into compromising positions. Recognizing this pattern, he embarks on a deliberate process of severing his emotional attachment to such approval. Through careful self-observation and gradual exposure to disapproval without negative consequences, he slowly destroys this particular avenue of vulnerability. Where once stood a man who could be controlled through the withholding or granting of approval, now stands one who operates from internal validation alone. This process requires extraordinary self-honesty and courage. It demands that the individual examine their deepest motivations, acknowledge their most shameful fears, and confront the aspects of their personality that they have perhaps spent years building and defending. The businessman must admit his desperate need to be seen as successful. The intellectual must acknowledge her terror of being thought foolish. The leader must face his fear of being alone and unloved. The destruction of these weaknesses does not happen through suppression or denial. Such approaches typically strengthen the very patterns they seek to eliminate. Instead, it requires a process that might be called conscious dissolution, the gradual withdrawal of emotional investment from these vulnerable aspects of self until they lose their power to drive behavior or create points of leverage for others. One powerful technique involves what could be termed worst-case visualization, deliberately imagining and mentally rehearsing the complete failure or loss of whatever one fears losing most. The entrepreneur terrified of bankruptcy spends time visualizing in detail what such an outcome would entail, how she would respond, and how she would rebuild. Through repeated exposure to this scenario and imagination, the terror gradually loses its grip, and, with it, the desperate behaviors designed to avoid such an outcome. This process often reveals that many of our deepest fears, when examined closely, lose much of their power. The social anxiety that drives conformist behavior dissolves when one truly accepts the possibility of social rejection and develops genuine indifference to the opinions of those whose approval was previously essential. The fear of financial loss that creates desperate, short-sighted decision-making evaporates when one becomes genuinely comfortable with the idea of starting over from nothing. The transformation required here extends beyond mere emotional detachment. It involves rewiring fundamental identity structures, questioning the very assumptions about what makes life worth living that have previously driven all major decisions. The individual must be willing to sacrifice not just comfort and security, but even cherished beliefs about who they are and what they value. This process often involves deliberate exposure to discomfort and loss. The person seeking to destroy their attachment to luxury deliberately embraces periods of austerity, learning to find satisfaction in simplicity. The individual dependent on constant social stimulation spends extended periods in solitude, discovering resources of self-sufficiency they never knew existed. The chronic people-pleaser practices saying no without explanation or apology, gradually developing comfort with others' disappointment. Each successful destruction of a weakness creates space for the development of genuine strength. Where once stood fear-driven behaviors, strategic thinking can emerge. Where emotional neediness once created vulnerability, self-sufficiency provides unshakable foundation. Where ego investment created defensive reactions, detached analysis enables optimal responses. The social implications of this transformation can be dramatic. As the individual sheds the predictable vulnerabilities that others have learned to exploit, their behavior becomes increasingly unpredictable and difficult to manipulate. Former friends and colleagues who had unconsciously relied on these pressure points to influence behavior may find themselves suddenly powerless to predict or control the transformed individual's responses. This unpredictability itself becomes a form of strength. The negotiator who has destroyed his attachment to being liked can walk away from any deal without emotional distress, giving him tremendous leverage. The leader who has eliminated her need to be right can change course without ego investment, enabling optimal strategic flexibility. The entrepreneur who has killed his fear of failure can take calculated risks that others find paralyzing. Yet this process of self-destruction must be undertaken with wisdom and discrimination. Not all aspects of vulnerability should be eliminated. Compassion, love, and human connection require certain forms of openness and emotional investment. The art lies in distinguishing between vulnerabilities that serve no useful purpose and those that connect us to what makes life meaningful. The master of this practice learns to maintain what might be called selective vulnerability, remaining open to love, beauty, and human connection while becoming impervious to manipulation, control, and exploitation. This discrimination requires ongoing refinement and careful attention to the results of various experiments in detachment. Some attempt this transformation through sudden, dramatic changes, quitting jobs, ending relationships, or making radical lifestyle alterations. While sometimes effective, such approaches often create more problems than they solve, destroying valuable connections along with genuine vulnerabilities. The more sustainable approach involves gradual, systematic elimination of specific weaknesses while preserving and strengthening genuine sources of meaning and connection. The process of destroying the weak self often reveals the arbitrary nature of many strongly held beliefs and attachments. The individual who successfully eliminates their desperate need for financial security may discover that their relationship to money was based more on social conditioning than on genuine personal values. The person who destroys their attachment to others' opinions often finds that their self-concept had been almost entirely externally determined. This revelation can be both liberating and disorienting. As layer after layer of conditioned response and social programming is stripped away, what remains may be surprisingly different from what the individual expected to find. The process often leads to fundamental questions about identity, purpose, and meaning that must be answered from this new perspective of freedom from conventional vulnerabilities. The individual who has successfully destroyed their weak self often reports a peculiar sense of invulnerability coupled with profound peace. No longer driven by desperate needs or paralyzed by specific fears, they find themselves able to engage with challenges from a position of strength and choice rather than compulsion and avoidance. This shift in orientation transforms not just how they respond to threats, but how they pursue opportunities and build relationships. Yet perhaps the most profound aspect of this transformation is how it affects one's relationship to suffering and loss. When the weak self has been destroyed, what remains is often surprisingly resilient and adaptable. Setbacks that would devastate the emotionally dependent individual become mere data points for the person who has learned to find their center within themselves rather than in external circumstances. This resilience creates a feedback loop that accelerates further development. As the individual demonstrates to themselves their capacity to survive and thrive despite losses that they previously considered catastrophic, their confidence in their ability to handle whatever life presents grows exponentially. This confidence, born of actual experience rather than mere hope, becomes an unshakable foundation for taking larger risks and pursuing more ambitious goals. The completion of this phase of transformation, the successful destruction of the weak self, sets the stage for the final integration, where the benefits of unreadability and invulnerability combine to create something approaching the Machiavellian ideal of personal sovereignty. Part 3, The Sovereignty of the Integrated Self. The final phase of this transformation involves the integration of unreadable focus with the invulnerability achieved through the destruction of the weak self. This synthesis creates what might be called the sovereign individual, someone who operates from a position of such internal strength and external opacity that conventional forms of influence, manipulation, and control become not just ineffective, but irrelevant. This integrated state represents more than the sum of its parts. The combination of unreadability and invulnerability creates emergent properties that transform not just how the individual interacts with the world, but how the world responds to them. Like a master martial artist who has transcended the need for defensive positioning because they have eliminated the targets that opponents typically attack, the sovereign individual finds themselves operating in a realm beyond conventional conflict. The businessman who has achieved this integration sits in board meetings where others engage in elaborate political maneuvering, emotional manipulation, and ego-driven posturing, while he simply focuses on optimal outcomes with the detached interest of a scientist studying an interesting phenomenon. His colleagues' attempts to provoke, intimidate, or seduce him into suboptimal decisions meet with the same responsive interest he might show toward any other environmental factor that must be considered in his calculations. This is not coldness or lack of engagement, but rather a form of engagement so pure and strategic that it transcends the emotional drama that typically clouds decision-making in human interactions. The sovereign individual participates fully in life while remaining fundamentally untouchable by the psychological games that consume so much of others' energy and attention. The development of this integrated state often leads to profound shifts in how one perceives power itself. The conventional understanding of power as the ability to control or influence others gives way to a deeper recognition that true power lies in the complete sovereignty over one's own responses, decisions, and internal states. When one cannot be manipulated, threatened, or seduced into acting against their better judgment, they possess a form of power that is both absolute within its domain and completely independent of external circumstances. This sovereignty manifests in practical ways that can seem almost supernatural to those still trapped in reactive patterns. The sovereign individual can walk away from any situation that does not serve their purposes without internal conflict or external drama. They can change course dramatically when circumstances require it without ego investment in previous decisions. They can engage with hostile or manipulative individuals without becoming defensive or reactive, often disarming such people through their very unflappability. Perhaps most remarkably, the sovereign individual often discovers that their refusal to engage in conventional power struggles paradoxically increases their influence and effectiveness. When others cannot predict, manipulate, or emotionally affect someone, they often begin to defer to that person's judgment, seek their approval, or attempt to understand their perspective. The vacuum created by the absence of conventional vulnerabilities often draws others into a dynamic where they unconsciously grant authority to the one who remains unaffected by their usual tactics. This phenomenon creates interesting ethical considerations. The sovereign individual possesses significant power over others precisely because they cannot be similarly affected. This asymmetry requires careful consideration of how such power should be exercised. The Machiavellian tradition provides guidance here. Power should be used strategically and, with long-term thinking, but always with awareness of the responsibility that comes with such capability. The sovereign individual often finds themselves becoming an involuntary counselor or advisor to others who sense their stability and clarity but cannot identify its source. People are naturally drawn to those who seem to possess inner certainty and external composure, often seeking guidance or simply the comfort of being around someone who appears to have solved problems that continue to torment them. This role requires wisdom and discretion. The sovereign individual must learn to distinguish between those who can genuinely benefit from their perspective and those who seek to exploit their stability for temporary comfort without making the difficult changes that true transformation requires. The temptation to become a guru or authority figure must be balanced against the recognition that each person must ultimately develop their own sovereignty through their own efforts. The maintenance of this integrated state requires ongoing vigilance and refinement. New vulnerabilities can develop as circumstances change, and the opacity that serves one well in competitive environments may need to be modified for intimate relationships or collaborative endeavors. The sovereign individual must remain flexible and adaptive while maintaining their core invulnerability. One of the most challenging aspects of this integration involves learning to form genuine connections with others while maintaining essential boundaries. The unreadable, invulnerable individual can seem cold or distant to those seeking traditional forms of emotional connection. Learning to express warmth, care, and engagement while preserving one's essential untouchability requires subtle skill and ongoing adjustment based on context and relationship. The sovereign individual often develops what might be called graduated transparency, the ability to reveal different levels of their inner world to different people based on the nature of the relationship and the trustworthiness of the individual. This is not deception but rather strategic disclosure that preserves both intimacy where appropriate and protection where necessary. In romantic relationships, this integration can create particularly complex dynamics. The sovereign individual must learn to love without desperation, to commit without loss of independence, and to remain vulnerable to their chosen partner while maintaining invulnerability to manipulation or emotional blackmail. This requires finding partners who are themselves developing sovereignty, or at least who appreciate and respect these qualities rather than seeing them as obstacles to overcome. Professional relationships often become significantly more effective once this integration is achieved. The sovereign individual can engage in partnerships, employment, or leadership roles with clarity about their own boundaries and objectives while remaining completely flexible about methods and approaches. They can delegate authority without losing control, accept criticism without becoming defensive, and make difficult decisions without being paralyzed by the emotional reactions of others. The long-term trajectory of someone who has achieved this integration often involves a gradual expansion of their sphere of influence and effectiveness. Because they are not constantly managing their own emotional reactions or defending against others' manipulations, they have tremendous energy available for creative and productive endeavors. Their consistency and reliability make them valuable partners and allies, while their strategic thinking and emotional stability often position them naturally for leadership roles. Yet perhaps the most profound aspect of this transformation is the inner peace that emerges from no longer being at war with oneself or constantly vigilant against others' attempts to control or influence. The sovereign individual has created an internal sanctuary that remains untouched regardless of external circumstances. This peace is not passive withdrawal from life but, rather active engagement from a position of strength and choice. The achieved integration often leads to what might be called effortless effectiveness, the ability to accomplish significant objectives without struggle or drama. Because the sovereign individual is not fighting internal conflicts or external power struggles, their energy flows directly toward their chosen goals with minimal waste or misdirection. Projects that would exhaust others through emotional turmoil and interpersonal complications often proceed smoothly and efficiently. This effectiveness can sometimes create new challenges as others attempt to understand or replicate the sovereign individual's approach. The temptation to teach or share these insights must be balanced against the recognition that such transformation cannot be given to others but must be earned through personal effort and experience. The sovereign individual must learn to be helpful without enabling dependence, influential without being controlling. The ultimate fruit of this integration is perhaps the recognition that the entire journey, from transparency to opacity, from vulnerability to invulnerability, from reactivity to sovereignty, represents not an escape from human nature but, rather, its fulfillment. The sovereign individual has not transcended humanity but has realized its highest potential for conscious, strategic engagement with life. In the end, what Machiavelli intuited centuries ago remains profoundly true: those who achieve complete focus and strategic self-transformation become not just unreadable and unmanipulable, but create for themselves a form of existence that operates according to entirely different principles than those governing ordinary human interaction. They achieve not just tactical advantages but fundamental freedom, the freedom to engage with life from a position of strength, choice, and authentic self-determination. This transformation, while demanding and sometimes isolating, ultimately serves not just the individual but the broader human community. The sovereign individual becomes a beacon of what is possible when human consciousness is deliberately developed and strategically applied. They demonstrate that it is possible to engage fully with life while remaining fundamentally free, to care deeply while avoiding desperation, and to wield power responsibly while remaining personally invulnerable to the corruptions that power typically brings. The path outlined here is not for everyone, nor should it be. It requires sacrifices that many would find unacceptable and offers rewards that many would not value. Yet for those called to such transformation, it provides a roadmap toward a form of human development that transcends conventional limitations and creates possibilities for engagement with life that are both profoundly effective and ultimately liberating. In achieving this integration of focus and invulnerability, the individual has not just protected themselves from others' attempts at destruction, they have rendered such attempts meaningless by destroying everything in themselves that could serve as a target. What remains is not diminished but, rather, purified, concentrated, and unassailable. They have become, in the deepest sense, their own creation and their own master, accountable to their chosen principles rather than to others' manipulations, and free to engage with life from a position of authentic strength and strategic clarity.